Welcome to our Success Stories event, a popular work on climate community event series. We're excited to have you all here today. My name is Sydney Hodges, and I'm joining from San Diego. My colleague for today's event on the support side of things is Lily, and we are both part of a large volunteer team at the Work on Climate organization, whose mission is to help people turn their professional work into the building blocks for a regenerative green economy. We do that by cultivating professional networks, including a global Slack community with over 30,000 members offering free climate expert hours and producing events focused on building skills, connections, and knowledge, similar to this one. If you're interested in joining us, please check out the links that Lily is putting in the chat. All right. Also, just to let you know kind of how today's session will go, we'll share all the resources and the presentation deck and the recording of the event to all attendees, as well as throughout in the chat. Our event today will follow the following format. Each of the 4 speakers will introduce themselves and discuss their climate career transition. Many of them share a common theme of founding a career in the climate space. And they'll also talk about obstacles they encountered and strategies they used to overcome them. Additionally, they'll share resources they found useful in their own journey. We will also share them in the chat and the email after the event. Each speaker will have about 7 minutes for their presentation, and after each speaker, we will select 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Please pop those into the chat throughout, and we'll be able to use them. After each participant speaks, we'll break out into 4 rooms and let our attendees join any speaker room they choose. You'll be able to move from room to room at your own pace. The rooms will be open for about 15 minutes to ask additional questions and discuss topics. In the last section of the event, we'll welcome you back to share any insights from those breakout room conversations. Our speakers today were selected from the Call for Speakers campaign, and the forum is open for anybody who wants to share their climate journey at this quarterly event series. Our speakers represent different stages of their career, and also their transition happened at different times. It'll be great to see kind of different perspectives and different spaces within the climate realm, and how each of them got there. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Anthony Igumwaye. Anthony is an engineer and social entrepreneur, passionate about using clean technology to create opportunity. Through his venture, Kavlum, he's helping rickshaw drivers in Africa switch to electric vehicles, lowering costs and emissions whilst building stronger communities. Anthony, over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate you all coming on here. Super amazing to just take a look at everyone and just have a complete idea of where everyone is coming from. I'm curious, just maybe I might not be able to see it here on, but show of hands, how many people are currently in the climate space right now? Like if your work or anything is related to climate, we'd love to see your hand. You can put like the emoji, raise your hand thing on, or the thumbs up. Okay, it's great. All right, nice. How many people are looking at transitioning into climate space right now? Okay, it's great. I'm just going around looking at seeing everything like that. Great, great. Okay, that's super. That is super amazing. Fantastic. So my story basically, it started like most of you all here, just curiosity, and started over from school actually. But it was not until I started working that I actually discovered. So pay attention to the careers that you're in right now, whatever you guys are doing. Most of what you're passionate about would come from there, and sometimes it could come from outside there too. But pay strong attention to that. And so I started out my first climate or clean tech venture just building electric semi trucks. So those, you know, 18-foot wheelers that you might see on the road driving across the highways. Uh, and sometimes you might worry and you might speed past them because you don't want them near you. Yeah, we were actually electrifying those as a startup, actually, as a 5-man startup. And later it grew to about 20 people, but I was one of the early people in there. And I got in this job a year just after graduation, which was in 2017, 2018, if I remember correctly. And so I was kind of like the lead engineer there, just building and trying to convince transport companies that, hey, diesel is expensive, it's costly. It'll be cool if you switch to electric. So that was my job, and we actually got to work actually building that, and testing that, just using the standard um, or procedures, and basically using the principles for an electric car development, but now for semi truck. So more power, bigger battery, everything is just bigger, like the Texas people like to say. So we did that, and so coming out of that, I went into what you call an entrepreneurship program at Queen's University in Kingston, where after working at building electric semi trucks for 3 years, I went in and I kind of did that, building what we call a case study for what would become Kavlam Enterprise. And so, because my program was very hands-on and very experiential, I was supposed to come out with a company after, which I did. That became Kavlam Enterprise, and the goal was simple. If we have electric vehicles in America, US, sorry, America, Europe, UK, and all, how do we develop that for emerging communities in low or economies that are still developing? And that was really the question that I asked myself. And so what we got to do was that I traveled back to Nigeria in about 2020, 2021. I was in this tuk-tuk rickshaw. Some of you might have entered some of them, but I've been on some of them. And basically, they were just polluting the entire atmosphere. For me, it was just curiosity. I was like, what's going on? And, I was told then that we can't buy actual gasoline to actually run our rickshaws because it's super expensive. And so what we're doing is we're buying what they call the adulterated one. And so they mix it with all sort of stuff. It's actually a practice that actually goes on. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, is that a thing? I'm only used to going to like Shell to buy gas. And I didn't even know that was a thing. As much as I knew that it was very odd. So I spoke to about 100 of them at that point in time. And then we started seeing a pattern that it was just cost. And so what actually happens is that they actually end up paying a lot more over a longer period because it breaks down. Bad things happen. They take it to the mechanic every 2 weeks. It gets fixed up. They do the same thing, breaks down again. So that's where I started, and that was how I created the first blueprint for Kavlam, which is just converting gasoline vehicles to electric because we couldn't sell them a brand new electric rickshaw. That would be too costly. We put them at about $6,000, $7,000 for a family that makes about $20 a day. That would be super insane for them. And so we had to settle for using existing kind of, if you've ever retrofitted your bicycle, if you've ever seen electric bikes, it's basically similar technology at that point. And so we were able to get those in and convert it for them. And that started what would become Kavlam Enterprise. And so now we've been working on utilizing what we call circular economy and its clean mobility initiatives, reaching out to organizations in the clean and climate space, tapping into corporate social responsibility for companies, especially oil companies that actually have a lot of business in emerging markets, and now using that as a sort of social impact to actually get the companies to push a lot of their social impact agendas using their sustainable development goal. And so we've become more consulting and implementation at the same time, being able to develop these projects, deploy them, and tie them to valuable metrics. Now, if you go to the next page, maybe there, we can see that one of the biggest problems that we faced was just high cost of EV adoption. That's actually why we actually did the conversion because it was a lot easier. Um, and so that finance structure, which is not available in a lot of emerging markets, just made it hard. Obviously, I was dealing in a country like Nigeria earlier on. So the infrastructure for charging an unreliable power supply, which, it's still a problem even in a country like the United States, Canada. So you could imagine doing this in sub-Saharan Africa, how challenging it must be, which is why we stuck to three-wheelers and, motorcycles and under, because for cars, it would just become too complex and the structure will not even be able to support it. So we started doing a lot of battery swapping, where it's a smaller battery. You can charge all of them at one place. The driver comes, you swap it out, they have new energy. And so what we actually made to actually overcome some of this, and I'll explain that next, is basically tying it into corporates and their struggles to actually find projects that create real social impact. And companies are struggling with this. They do one-off project for the CSR. They have no idea to track what the value is at the end of the day. And so we were able to tie that conversation to say, not only is this rickshaw great for the community, it ties into your social impact, initiatives this way, and we can help you deliver a monitoring, evaluation, and improvement plan. Just to say that, just to show how your $1 creates 0.5 cents to be able to create another rickshaw, which is something that we're really focused about. So we're sort of turning this into some sort of sustainable linear investment. And so what we've been able to do now is create the CSR driven funding model, where we're partnering now with corporations to actually finance these conversions at a two-third cost to the driver, right? At least at the initial stage, which ensures affordability for the drivers to get on board. The battery swap ecosystem makes it easier because not only can they drive for cheap now, they can actually provide powers to their homes at night. So imagine driving your Tesla car and you don't have electricity at night and you go back home and you power back home, which is the vehicle to grid technology of V2X. Some of you might be familiar with that. We're just doing that on a way smaller scale so that we can have massive impact across. And then obviously the circular economy innovation. What do you do with the engines that come out of these vehicles? What happens to them? And so what we started doing was beginning to look at how we can recycle, break down some of those parts by working with partners who do a lot of metal recycling. Some people actually take out old engines, break them off, and you can use some processes to actually turn those into metal 3D powder that you can use for 3D printing. So all of a sudden, waste becomes feedstock for a new product and a new service, and you can make jewelries from it. You don't even have to make anything EV with it. You could do a lot of things in it. So you can see how one little problem, right, of just making rickshaw cheaper for drivers has created cascade of potential opportunities to go into and avenues for just partnership across the board. And the goal here is not to take on everything for yourself, is to find the partners who are already doing this so that they can help you accelerate. So keep that word in mind, partnership, because it's very important, especially in climate space that has to deal with a lot of hardware. And so maybe you can go to the next stage. And so obviously some of the I've been very fortunate enough to have gotten my first funding through like a tribe network in Halifax. They support Black founders. I also work with Nobelum supporting Black founders as well. Dalhousie in University of Nova Scotia, the Patty Family Foundation through St. Francis Xavier University, and just learning, right? Like even the work on climate community is just super great for that, because now you're meeting other founders like you and you can brainstorm. And this is where some of the partnerships will come from, because they might be doing something and they need maybe a process from yours to support theirs, and you can leverage each other to grow, not just individually, but as a community, right? And so these are some of the initiatives and the organizations that we've kind of reached out to and work with. How many minutes do I have left?
You can wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes, and then
Okay.
folks, if you have questions, type them in the chat.
Awesome. So yeah, that's basically it. Take advantage of the free information out there, but look for climate-driven accelerators to even learn from. Carbon 13, Foresight in Canada, MIT Climate and Energy Lectures. I always watch and learn from these people, and even founders who are doing other things in climate space. It's very important because you might be able to solve a portion of the problem that they're handling, and that actually creates a venture for yourself. So I'll end with that. Feel free to connect with me. Really curious to see what everyone else is working on, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing your story, Anthony. If anyone has any questions, we can pause for 1 or 2 minutes. Just please add them to the chat. I'll get started. Anthony, when you were approaching this problem, there's a lot going on. You're, going to sub-Saharan Africa, you're learning about these rickshaws and how to switch them over to electric. Like, how did you start? How did you not get overwhelmed by like, I need to buy these parts, I need to find the people who are willing to experiment with this new technology, I need to make it sustainable. Like, can you talk us through your mentality there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had was part of a program called the Patty Family Foundation. So I was in school then, and so that was my final year. And that program was administered through St. Francis Xavier University in Antigua, Nova Scotia, in partnership with the Cody Educational Institute. They do a lot of educational development work. And so they had brought us through this program cohort where we learned about managing your energy, not just managing your time. Most people think of time management, but most people don't think of energy management. So that's number one. But I think another thing I was able to do was really leverage the communities that we were developing this for. That was very important. That's why, again, I'll come back to the word partnership. It's super important. Most of the questions that funders or investors would ask you about is, if you've done this, how do you do this? There's always going to be questions to your entire value chain, and partners allow you answer these things really fast. And so what I was able to do was really find ways to delegate as much as the work or the byproducts of anything I was doing out, so that when I create that entire value and present it to investors or funders, they understand that there's a complete answer to how we get there. Like, I have no business actually recycling the engines that come out of there, but it's super valuable, right? To be like, we're not taking these engines and dumping them somewhere, which creates another landfill problem. We've actually thought about how we get this into the value and the supply chain. And so that being like, oh, he's really thinking of this too. And so one way to not get overwhelmed is to really have a group of people. Again, community and partnership is super important. Speak to people, find out who else is doing what might be valuable. I would just go and do random searches of companies that are recycling, right? That's just it. Like, and I would start looking for them and start speaking with people there. Companies who are working in something similar in emerging markets. And now we're looking at a program in Ethiopia and Tanzania right now, where we might be able to support women who are driving rickshaws in Tanzania to actually have an initiative where they are actually championing green rickshaws because of that type of work that we're able to do. And so one of the things that we need to do is to be able to work with some of the female entrepreneurs on the ground who are going to support us with helping us launch and drive this. And not only are we going to be able to use the funding to create jobs, but now we're actually able to help drive impact, because part of the work we're doing is educational as well. And so that's very crucial.
All right. Thanks so much, Anthony. For anyone else who has more questions, we'll have breakout sessions after everyone speaks where you can chat to Anthony more about what he's up to. Our second speaker is Dr. Leslie Field. Leslie is an inventor, teacher, founder, mom, and engineer. To help her children and all of us, she has been focusing on the climate for the past 20 years, mainly focused on locally preserving bright reflective ice with environmentally benign materials. She's an MIT alum who studied chemical engineering and later went on to study electrical engineering and microfabrication at UC Berkeley, where she earned her PhD. And she's been teaching climate solutions at Stanford for the last 15 years. So thanks very much, Leslie. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Um, yeah, you had asked for a compelling statement, and I'd say that after seeing the Al Gore movie years ago when my kids were pretty young, 6 and 10 years old, I realized that if people weren't doing something about climate, it was going to be hard, even here in rather mild California, to see how they're going to have a very good life ahead of them. That was what I got from the Gore movie. And so I started considering this statement that I had learned from a mentor at HP Labs, where I'd been working for years, that if not me, who? And if not now, when? And I have found that this is actually a pretty viral statement, as I have taught for these 15 years at Stanford. Um, I uh, I found that this really resonated with students, and they would send this back to me in their essays about, wow, that really got in my head, and it really does. So that's a that's a useful thing to think about if you see some giant problem, who's and you don't see that other people addressing it enough, why not try to start something yourself? So what came out to me from the Gore movie especially was the fact that ice melt in the Arctic, in the ocean, in glacial areas as well, is just really it's part of a positive feedback loop. And that sounds like maybe that's all sunny and wonderful, but no, in engineering speak, a positive feedback loop means that the more it happens, the faster it keeps happening. And if it's got a bad outcome, that means that this is really a very key leverage point that you want to try to address to slow down. So we started out with, you've probably seen some of the alarming, how much less ice there is now in the ocean up in the Arctic than there used to be, sea ice. And that's all true, and it has been accelerating faster than anybody had expected. And that was where I thought we should be working to start with. But the problem with that is that that's all interconnected with the oceans worldwide. And that tends to worry people. In fact, it worries me as well. Well, what if you're not absolutely sure this is absolutely safe? And so when we got invited, and in fact, the things we're very safe and done in a very small scale on test ponds with everybody's permission for us to do it, locally, indigenous populations, you know, uh, actually getting the permits for us because they could tell this was safe enough. Well, very safe. And what really got me interested in glaciers was that people in the communities there actually were seeing terrible outcomes already from not being able to grow their crops as as glaciers were melting more and more. You don't have a predictable water supply anymore, and the Himalayas are an essential place to have. They're called the water towers of Asia, and that really is supporting the agriculture of about a third of the world, is what I understand, and that's a big deal. And so we got invited to work there, and we got through a person who's a dual citizenship, U.S. and India. We got connected with a wonderful glaciologist and a wonderful environmental impact assessment specialist, and their students. You just couldn't ask for a better team. And so a few of us from the U.S. Went there to work and see what we could do for glacial ice. And it was really a very amazing trip. It was, and it benefited from all the work that I'd done previously, with our team. We've had some wonderful collaborators from other parts of the U.S. and such over time, and uh, and it was a wonderful experience. Um, but I must say, personally, I got altitude sickness because this was set up for people who were in that area often, and I basically live at sea level. So I don't think I get to go back to that test site again, because we couldn't do the acclimatization gradually enough for me to stay healthy. But there are other parts in the world that have terrible problems with their glaciers as well. The good part of what we found was that the new materials that we had to adopt, and again, some of our Minnesota team are the ones who made that happen, uh, are are really even more effective at brightening the ice. And why would you want to brighten ice? Why would you want to preserve it? Because that helps you reflect the sunlight back. And so as the world is heating up, the cooler you can keep ice or the ground beneath it, the better off you're going to be at reducing these problems of extreme melting, of heat deaths, which happen all too often in India, and of crop failures. And so that's why we're working on it. And there are other areas in the world that need this sort of help as well. So the results were spectacular. We had a I guess by a factor of 2 or 3 higher reflectivity than we'd had with our previous materials that we were working on pond ice with. And it's so we've been doing the thing that you do as a scientist. We've been publishing in peer-reviewed, credible publications and things like that, so you can read about it. We always do that for the journals that have free access to read what's been put there, because you don't want to have it be a secret. So that's basically that. One of the other aspects of this that's extremely important, and you've probably heard already a bit about this from me just now, about how we include the community. There's a whole stream of an ethical, transparent framework that you really want to adhere to allow you to be sure that people who live in the area that might be affected by what you do are well informed about this, are in support of this. And one of the basics here is you just start, and I worked with the AGU, American Geophysical Union, to help them update this framework, because I've had some on the ground experience with all this. And what's really important is that you start small with whatever you're doing, and you do it in a way that you could reverse if there were any unintended consequence. You could, scrape things away. You could, so we do something called surface albedo. Albedo is brightness modification, so that we could quickly take things away if we found there was any bad impact. But of course, you study the materials a lot before you start, so that you uh, know what's likely the outcome. And things have the environmental impact assessment specialist has come out with a very clean report on this, and she's a diligent person who grew up in the Himalayas, so she would care a lot about the local water supply and such. So that's basically the sorts of frameworks that you have to consider, and do things in a responsible and localized manner. And I'm proud of what we've been able to do with that. Um, and I guess, if time is short, I could stop there, or how much time do I have left? I could talk about teaching a bit, because I think that's been an awfully important part of helping, this, to helping educate students in how they might come out with innovative solutions, or pivoting solutions that were already known, or nature-based solutions in particular. So, Sydney, how much time do I have?
Got about 2 minutes. And if
Oh,
anyone
and I can
has
go through all
questions
of this.
for Leslie, please post them in the chat as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so yeah, I did come into this whole nonprofit area with my experience of running a group was a consulting company, very different experience. Um, And so I didn't major in entrepreneurship in school. I really deeply knew I wanted to be an engineer and an inventor, and that's what I've done. So that was not a feature to not have been experienced in that before. And I was one of the very first people to look at, the Gore movie and have it activate me to say, well, heavens, then let's do something about this melting ice thing. And so it wasn't a popular thing then. If you tell people what you were working on back then, well, I'd like to preserve ice, you sort of got a lot of blank stares back then. And the public funding is an issue as well, especially right now in the US. And so, and that has led to my class, which was focusing on climate, which isn't very popular right now in some quarters, to be canceled at Stanford. So my 15 years and teaching about 400 students as I added up, okay, that's gone for now. But I'm moving on. We're pivoting my consulting company into a solutions company that I think is going to make some good impacts. And so it's, one has to keep agile and keep pivoting to what's actually going to work well in whatever the environment you're in now. And that being willing to pivot is pretty key in my life. And I suspect that's true for most of you watching, and certainly for our co-participants here. So yeah, I look forward to addressing your questions or having further discussions in the breakout. And I'm really honored and delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leslie. All right, our third speaker, speaking about difficulties finding financing. Our third speaker is Pooja Balachander. Pooja is the co-founder of UpGreen, a climate tech startup unlocking retrofit finance for SME landlords to drive energy efficiency in commercial buildings. She's also director of venture at Carbon 13, where she supports pre-seed and seed stage climate tech founders to accelerate their progress. Previously, Pooja founded and exited Devi, a health tech startup, and led product at Think of Us, a civic tech company driving systems change in child welfare. Her career spans the World Bank, the White House Presidential Innovation Fellows, and the City of Austin, where she worked on improving public services. With a BA in International Studies from American University and an MBA from Oxford, Pooja brings a unique blend of entrepreneurial, product, and investment experience to advancing the just transition. Thanks, Pooja.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me. I think, as Sydney kind of alluded to, my journey has been really like not linear at all. I first started wanting to be a diplomat, hence the international studies degree. And I was, like really into Model United Nations. That felt like really kind of where my passion lied. Um, and ended up, so I was working in development for a bit. It just happened to be that my first job out of college, which I think most people will attest to, you just kind of take the first thing you can get, was an admin job in the Obama administration in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the Presidential Innovation Fellows. So I sort of, just by happenstance kind of ended up falling into public sector and sort of not international at all, actually. But ended up working domestically and because I worked for this program called the Presidential Innovation Fellows, it was really bringing like private sector, mostly former founders and reasonably successfully exited founders into government to do some sort of like digital transformation type work. And because I was working quite closely with them, I ended up developing a lot of like the product and design skills that I'm still using honestly today. Um, so started there. Of course, then I was in the last 2 years of the Obama administration. So once the election happened, I moved to the World Bank, where I was working in Madagascar on chronic malnutrition, but honestly using very similar skills. So I was using sort of like design and innovation consulting, supporting the government there to do it and basically like pilot new public health interventions. And then from there, moved to the city of Austin, and because there was like a bloodless coup in Madagascar. And all of the people, like the ministers that had been sponsoring our project at the time, were just like replaced overnight. And so, I thought I would be spending a while there and actually like really trying to entrench what I was doing. It didn't end up happening. So moved to the city of Austin for and also applied to grad school at the same time. Because honestly at the time, and I think maybe this is a sort of lesson, rather than sort of picking a path, I had a few hypotheses of things that might be interesting. So, I came across this fellowship at the city of Austin where it felt a lot more local. So one of the things that I had been burned by twice was like basically changes in government, undoing everything I had done in the last however long I had been working. And so I thought, okay, working at the more local level could be interesting. It might actually be like there might be more longevity there. The other side was I was like, okay, I'm kind of over public sector in general. Maybe I should just go do an MBA and transition to private sector, do something totally different. And so I applied to an MBA program. I was also just like really enjoyed being in sub-Saharan Africa and living there in Madagascar and doing so much field work and actually being in international development. So I applied to a job at the One Acre Fund as a consultant as well to be in like rural Ethiopia for 2 years. So I applied to like vastly different things but each of them were sort of vaguely interesting to me. And I just figured like whatever worked out was what I would take. And to be on, and a couple of things worked out. So one was this fellowship at the city of Austin. And it was intended only to be a 6-month placement where I would come and like set up a sort of innovation lab and do some work there. And then, a couple months later, I found out I got into Oxford. So it really was only a 6-month gig that I would do that and then go. And so I would say just like sometimes cast the die strategically and be open to where where the randomness sort of takes you was definitely something, is definitely a trend in my career. And then, yeah, so did this work in Austin, went to Oxford, and when I was in my MBA, I was another kind of like totally blank slate because I was like, oh, I'll go to private sector, but that's obviously a very wide-ranging thing as well. I had ideas of like maybe I wanted to work in finance, maybe I wanted to start my own thing. Um, and I sort of tried to like sort of design an experience where I'd be able to test each thing. And so in the first couple weeks of my program, I met my former co-founder of my last startup, and sort of fell right into that and was really helping her with prototyping. She was a former preschool teacher who wanted to start something in early childhood development. My background was in product. So I was like, well, okay, I don't know how to solve these problems, but I can help you go from like, there's all of these problems to me. This is the like little bit of it that we want to attack, and here's how. So helped her with kind of structuring that thought process. At the same time, I was like, obviously an MBA is a good place to actually experiment with like, okay, I wanted to try finance lab and try that stuff. I wanted to try consulting. I wanted to do a few different things. The only sort of through line was that I wanted to do something impactful. I wasn't going to just kind of like go work for McKinsey and do whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that was like the only sort of must have in what I wanted to do. Um, and honestly, by the end, it just was whatever would work out. So by the end of my MBA time, the startup had really been taking off. Like we got our pre-seed funding, we had some early customers. It had just basically taken over my life. And so it became the only choice. And so that's what I did for the next few years. That was like I made probably every mistake in the book. Happy to talk about that if that's of interest myself. But then we ended up getting acquired by a US company called Think of Us. Basically, it was we were digitizing child psychology interventions and making them accessible to parents of children under 5. Think of Us works in child welfare reform. So it was basically a way to support a lot of the parents that they were supporting. Um, and it was also like a really good way for it to scale for me. Um, and then but that being said, then I was quite entrepreneurial. I felt like by the time I got to this company, I was quite bored, honestly, after the exit, and I wanted something new. I wanted to go into climate. I was sort of sick of being the parenting lady, if I'm being honest. Like working on any one thing, I think for like 5 years, you start to get curious about other stuff. So I wanted to transition into climate. I felt like the place I could make the most difference was maybe as an investor, because it felt like as a software kind of product person, the big opportunities for climate, that didn't feel like where I would be able to participate. And so so I was like, okay, well, I went through all of this whole fundraising process from the other side. Maybe I can try help on the investor side. So applied to Carbon 13, ended up coming there. And that's where I'm at now. In the process, I ended up finding that I was getting pitched by a lot of companies in this retrofit space, saw a gap in that area and started sort of tinkering on the side. And now I have a startup on that side as well. Um, but yeah, I think in the process, I've sort of developed a bit more of expertise around retrofit and built environment decarbonization in particular from my startup, and then pre-seed investment through Upgreen, and then both through Upgreen because I've now raised pre-seed investment for 2 companies myself. But then also having invested in a lot of startups through Carbon 13, especially in hardware, and across multiple markets and in a lot of different verticals. I think there are some cross-cutting things that I've learned through that as well. And then if I could just go to the next slide, Cindy. I think the high level sort of ecosystem barriers for me have been from my startup point of view, there's a lack of urgency and regulatory uncertainty. So I know I'm working in retrofit for buildings, like that's a reasonably political thing. And also, like, it just impacts a lot of people, right? Like, if you say that you can no longer rent out a building that's under a certain energy efficiency level, that puts a lot of people in financial strain. There's obviously a lot of baggage associated with that. In Europe, there's like famously much more stringent standards, but even that being said, like they're not enforced very well. So there's a lack of urgency on that side from the landlord's perspective, which makes it quite difficult to actually like motivate people to invest in the things that our startup at least is trying to get people to do. Um, the other is high cost of customer acquisition. I'm sure like every founder knows this, that like it's incredibly difficult to get someone to try your thing and actually do the thing you want them to do. No matter how like aligned their motivations are, no matter how much like user research you did in the first place. And so that's something that like I'm constantly struggling with. And trying to figure out like new ways of acquiring those customers more easily, but also like more cheaply, let's be honest, because otherwise your unit economics don't work. Which brings me to, for me, like both as a founder, but also as an investor, I think like the biggest challenge that I see is that people are either unclear or overambitious about their unit economics. Like I think almost every single person underestimates how much their go-to-market is actually going to cost them, how long it will take them to actually figure that out. Um, what their inputs actually are, how much they'll be able to bring down those costs. Again, how long that will take, especially on a hardware in a hardware kind of business model. And I think like related, one of my proven strategies is like really modeling those unit economics from the very, very beginning. So I know one of the first things I did for Upgreen was, and this was like definitely a lesson learned from my last startup because they just absolutely ran away with me from me. We had like a market sizing um, spreadsheet and just really modeled out every single input into it. Like how many partners would we need? How many customers would each of them bring in? Who would need to do that? How much time would it take? And there were just like every single thing was aligned. And we were able to kind of like scale that up and down and just see what would happen. And see if those assumptions were actually reasonable or not. And that really helped me with both understanding like what what were like the thresholds that I needed to meet for my business to be viable. But then the other side was actually the kind of funding I should raise. So for example, like with my second startup, it really felt like VC would not be appropriate. Like I would not probably get to like a 10x return in the next like 5 years. I wouldn't be able to get to the growth rates fast enough that I would need to justify the kind of valuations that they would need. And so I raised from angels and I raised from grants, but I think I wouldn't have known that that were the case if I didn't A, do the modeling, but B, like have all the mistakes that I made from my first startup and see a lot of the companies that I'm working with as well. But with that, maybe I'll pause there. I'm running out of time.
Yeah, I think that's been great. Thanks so much, Pooja. We'll have more time to speak with her in the breakout room, so save your questions for then. And in the meantime, let's transition over to our fourth and final speaker, Paul Zelizer. Paul is a business coach, podcaster, and ecosystem builder who has supported over 30,000 mission-driven founders and leaders worldwide. He hosts Awarepreneurs, the world's longest running social entrepreneurship podcast, and co-founded New Mexico Climate, a community for climate tech entrepreneurs in New Mexico with a background in counseling psychology and nearly 2 decades of ecosystem building. Paul now focuses much of his work on clean tech innovation, including NM Tech Talks and Desert Dev Lab, the region's first climate-focused hackathon. He is dedicated to helping clean tech and social impact companies thrive. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Sydney, and thanks, Work on Climate, for doing this. This is really great. So how many of you who are here in the audience today have no STEM background whatsoever? Just raise your hand or hit a button or something like that. Cool. Thanks for that. Certainly true for me. As you heard, my background is in counseling psychology, and like Pooja, did not take a linear path to where I am now. So in some ways, maybe I can be helpful to anybody, but especially those of you who don't have a STEM background. I just want to say there's lots of room for us and lots of need for us. And you'll hear more about that in the climate space and clean tech space. So yeah, originally my training is in counseling psychology. I've always been an innovator. I didn't know what social entrepreneurship was back in the day when I was making my career choices, but wanted to help and got involved in doing things like engaging young men as fathers, which there's a lot of research that when, at least when they're not abusive, when men are involved in their kids' lives, there's incredibly good outcomes in many different ways. Doing restorative justice and restorative practices when young people started to head down, if somebody stole something to support a drug habit rather than discard them into the prison industrial complex, how do we keep them in their communities and help them kind of turn their life around instead of losing them and all the pain and suffering and the multi-generational patterns that sets up. So that's where I started my career. And it wasn't always easy to get funding for that. So before I knew it, I was a nonprofit director and doing the awesome work and trying to fund in the mechanisms in the US that we have to do innovative work in the spaces I was doing. It was amazing. I did it for 15 years, but I burned out. Honestly, probably somewhere around year 8 or 9, kept trying to go and eventually just had to stop. I couldn't keep doing what I was doing, but I wasn't wired to not want to help in as impactful ways as I could. This was in 2007, and I started hearing more about social entrepreneurship. So I said, I guess I'm a social entrepreneur, and got on Twitter in 2008 when most people didn't know what Twitter was and social media was, just starting to happen. And the social entrepreneur and the impact and the clean tech space was a much smaller community then. And it turns out that there were incredibly knowledgeable people who were incredibly generous with their time, is the short answer of how I got to where I am. And I was willing to ask people questions in a very humble and very motivated way. I had a 6-year-old, I had been a nonprofit director, I didn't have a ton of money in the bank, and I needed to reinvent myself, in a pretty quick way, and people were really generous. That was one strategy. The other thing I would say is I was willing to think about how to provide value pretty early on. That was one of the big suggestions I got. Don't just take, but give to an ecosystem. So I started blogging pretty early on in my journey in social entrepreneurship, did that for 10 years, and I started telling stories of what other people were doing, and they were appreciative of my efforts to help amplify. The military would call somebody like me a force multiplier, and I've tried to do that now in my almost 20 years, excuse me, in the clean tech space. Eventually, the blogging, excuse me, pivoted to podcast, which is now the world's longest running social entrepreneur podcast in the world, 375 plus episodes. But I've continued that strategy is what are people doing that's working in the impact space, and unpack, the basic questions in the entrepreneur mind is oftentimes, what was your core idea? What were some of the pivots you had to make? What was your startup capital, path look like? How did you start to attract your first team members? How did you, what were some of the problems as you started to grow and scale? Those are the kinds of questions. And again, I didn't know a lot of the answers. Sometimes I didn't even know what the vocabulary was, but I was willing to amplify people who were doing good work, and they appreciated that. And then I made a really robust attempt to stay in touch with people, not seeing the podcast or the blog that I wrote as a one-time thing. And what happened was my network just kind of blew up, and that has been super helpful in my career growth. More recently, I'm focused here in New Mexico. I live in Albuquerque, and if you could go to the next slide, please, and start talking about what's happening here and the unique barriers and strategies. New Mexico is a historically poor, largely rural state with a historically anemic economy. We only have about 2.2 million people in the entire state. There's a joke in New Mexico, thank God for Mississippi. Mississippi and Alabama and New Mexico oftentimes are at the bottom of indicators that you don't want to be at the bottom of. Things like, education outcomes and the power of our economy. New Mexico is changing, and I'll talk about that in a second. But, when I got here in 1993, I rolled up my sleeves and tried to be a part of that. And that's continued on in the impact and the clean tech work that I do. New Mexico is also the first majority minority state in the United States, which means we are the first state where collectively our non-white population is exceeding 50%, largely because of a very large Hispanic or Latinx and Native American or indigenous population, but people come from all over the world. And we're the first state to be in that situation, which is both exciting but has challenges. And that there's very few examples in New Mexico of clean tech successes at scale. For instance, there's only one unicorn ever. It happens to be a clean tech company called Array Technologies. But in any sector in the whole history of the New Mexico entrepreneurial ecosystem, Array Technologies is the only unicorn ever. We've lost a lot of companies that started here, like Microsoft and others, that you would recognize the name. We've always had great talent here, but we don't have a great entrepreneurial ecosystem to, help those companies grow and scale. So a lot of our best founders leave the state. So 3 strategies that have really helped me in helping to, plug into New Mexico and do more and more of my work here. Partnerships is number 1. Anthony mentioned that. We have an incredible resource here in New Mexico, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds that the world has ever seen per capita. It's called the Permanent Fund. Right now, it stands at about $67 billion. And it turns out that what New Mexico calls advanced energy, which is really clean tech and things like geothermal and fusion. We also have really good wind and solar, incredible assets here. And the state's really leaning into that and building relationships with state partners. We just had a great conference, a 2-day conference yesterday and Monday called Building an Advanced Energy Ecosystem. The state leaders that are, learning from our clean tech ecosystem, I feel incredibly grateful to have direct relationships with them. One of the resources on my list is a interview with Representative Meredith Dixon, who is the key figure behind this conference. And that interview is her talking about what's happening in New Mexico in our ecosystem and how we're leveraging the sovereign wealth fund to do things that are pretty uncommon almost anywhere on the planet right now. So it's a really exciting ecosystem to be part of, but because we've been so historically anemic, we have to be smarter about how we use and share resources. We can't reinvent the wheel all the time, or at least we fail when we do. Another activity or a strategy that really has helped me move the needle on my career goals has been innovative programming. So for instance, this climate-focused hackathon that we're doing as part of NM Tech Talks in November, it's the first of its kind. We have hackathons and other things going on in the Southwest, but nobody's ever done a climate-focused hackathon as far as we're aware. And that's garnishing a lot of attention. And, given we're lining up where our innovative leaders in many different sectors in New Mexico, there's a consensus that advanced energy is a pathway to economic development and making some very significant positive changes. It's one of my personal values, and lining up my personal values with where the ecosystem that I operate in is trying to go, and then providing value there is something that has been really, really successful in terms of things that I'm trying to get done in my career. And then the last thing is storytelling. In general, New Mexico has absolutely sucked. This isn't just my opinion, at storytelling. But because my original training, I didn't know that it was going to be helpful in my, career goals in climate and clean tech. But because humans are my first place of study and understanding the power of imagery and storytelling, that's why I started blogging. And now I'm so passionate about podcasting, to be able to help New Mexico tell its story, whether it's an individual. We were talking, Anthony, about, somebody here, Solomon Gabara, who is leading our Blacks in Tech chapter. We have a new Blacks in Tech chapter, and he wanted to do an event that involved quite a bit of, fundraising, and I helped him think about, how could he tell his story. So whether it's an individual who's thinking about something they want to do in their career, or more on a statewide basis, just yesterday I confirmed that John Clark, who's the director of the State Investment Council, this is the organization that manages New Mexico's $67 billion fund called the Permanent Fund. I said to John at this conference, John, you guys aren't doing a great job of telling the story about the State Investment Council and a $67 billion. People want to hear about it. Would you come on my podcast? And he said yes. So I've been bold about leaning into that strategy. And that's been, again, makes me more valuable to my clients because I'm helping people do what they want, these leaders, but then I have these established relationships. And when a client is, needing to raise capital for something that they're doing in the clean tech space, I know many of the impact and clean tech focus VCs, because many of them are looking at New Mexico, really excited about by the $67 billion number, and have established relationships. That doesn't mean my clients are guaranteed to get funded, but it does mean that I have relationships with key players in public sector, VC spaces, talent. Somebody told me yesterday, Paul, you should start a recruiting firm because clean tech companies are growing so quickly in New Mexico, and I have these relationships. There's a lot of opportunities that all come from this network that I've spent 20 years building in the clean tech space. So those are a few of the strategies that have helped me and people in my network. And then the last page, the last slide is resources. And on there is my consulting site, the New Mexico Tech Talk site, a new initiative of mine about igniting opportunities for our diverse young people in New Mexico through innovative programming and community, the climate-focused hackathon called Desert Dev Lab, the Awarepreneurs Podcast, which is my podcast, interviewing social entrepreneurs and clean tech founders from all over the world about how did they build what they built, how did they fund it, what are some of the problems and pivots they've gone through. The interview with Meredith Dixon on the rapidly growing New Mexico clean tech ecosystem and how our permanent fund factors into that. And then lastly, NM Climate on LinkedIn, so you can get a sense of what we're doing here locally. So those are a few of the resources. And again, thanks for having me and thanks for doing this Work on Climate team.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you to all of our speakers for these lightning talks. I hope you, as the audience, found this as energizing as I have.